guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be doing a creature that I have never done before. I say that a lot. So I tend to make a lot of four-legged creatures, and whenever I make two-legged creatures they tend to be birds or dinosaurs. Well, this time around I'm going to be making a Minotaur. I thought it'd be a lot of fun, plus I could mess around with trying to make armor with it. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so for our Minotaur we actually have a decent amount of clay pieces to make. We need to make the head, the hands, the hooves, and I'm even going to be making him an axe. So I'm going to start with the head first, and then we'll move on to the other pieces. Now for the head, I'm going to start it off like I do with most of my heads. I just take a lump of tin foil, I place it on a glass container, and I start covering it in clay, blending everything together and just kind of getting a rough shape for the head. So once I have a basic shape laid out for the face, I'm going to mark out where I want different features on the face, like where I'm going to put the eyes, horns, ears, different things like that. So the first thing that I'm going to start adding to the face are going to be the eyes. Now I'm just using some very simple glass beads for this. I'm going to push them into the side of the face. Now if you're going to use glass beads for eyes, make sure that when you're placing them on the face that the holes for the beads are out of the way and kind of in a position where you can easily cover them in clay. Because you don't want a hole right in the middle of his eyeball. So I'm going to get those in position, make sure they're nice and even, and then I'm going to take some strips of clay and I'm going to build up the eyelids underneath the eye and over the eye. I can also add extra clay if I want to build up his cheekbones, but I really don't think I'll need to. Once I like how the eyes are looking, I'm going to move on to the snout. So I'm going to work on the nostrils and the mouth. Now I do want to add a ring to his nose, but I'm going to add that later. So we're going to get the nostrils sculpted first. I'm going to mark out where they are and just get a basic shape laid out for him. And then his mouth isn't going to be too complicated either. I'm just going to lay out a strip of clay, blend that upwards to make his upper lip, and then just define where I want the mouth to be. I want to get the mouth done and out of the way before I add the ring, mainly because I think the ring's going to be a little bit in the way for making the mouth. So I'm going to get the mouth and the nose completely sculpted, and then I'm going to take one of my cutting tools and I'm going to cut open the nose and kind of pull back his septum. So basically the portion right between the nostrils, I'm going to take that, I'm going to cut it off. I'm going to leave it still attached on one side, but I'm going to pull it up. And then I have a silver kind of ring that I decided looked really cool for this, and I'm going to lay that out, take the septum, fold it back over the ring, and blend everything back together. Now I'm not just resting the ring in place, I want to make sure it's nice and secure, so I am going to blend some of the clay into it and make sure that it's not going to wiggle around. Because if it's going to wiggle around, it has a chance of causing the nostrils to break. And then after that, I'm going to mark out some holes where we're going to add the horns and the ears. So make sure they're nice and deep so they're easy to work with, and then I'm going to clean up any excess clay that I don't want around the base of the head. I'm going to add a slight bit of texture to the face here and there where I know most of the fur is not going to cover it, because I am going to fur the face, but not all of that is going to get covered. So I do want to have some texture on the portions that I'm not going to cover up. And then once I'm happy with how the face looks, I'm going to put this in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for probably about 45 minutes. Next thing that we're going to do is the hooves. So I'm going to take 2 balls of even amounts of clay and I'm going to roll them out, push them onto the countertop, and try and make kind of a cone shape. And then I need to add a little bit of a wire at the top of this so that we can add it to the wireframe later. That way I have something to wrap onto. So I'm going to push that in at the top of the hoof, make sure it's kind of blended together so that it's not wiggling or anything like that. And then I'm going to divide the hoof into a cloven hoof and then add some different pieces to the backing of it. Once I like the basic shape of the hoof, I'm going to add a bit of texture to it, and then I'm going to throw these in the oven as well. They're kind of small, so they shouldn't need more than 35 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. Now we're going to start on the hands. So I'm going to start off with a piece of wire very similar to what we shoved into our hooves, and I'm going to put a ball of clay at the end of it. Then I'm going to take some smaller pieces of wire and I'm going to push these into that ball of clay and lay them out where I want the fingers to go. Now for this piece, I'm going to have one hand open and the other one is going to be closed. That way I can make him hold his axe. So I'm going to have the positions of the wires slightly different and I may have to bend them a little bit later. So now that we're at this point, I'm going to put these in the oven and pre-bake the clay that's holding all the wires together for about 20 or 25 minutes at the 275 Fahrenheit mark. So I'm going to let those bake. Once they're done and cooled, we can start adding the clay to the fingers. So I'm going to start by laying clay over all the wires and just kind of blending everything together and getting a basic shape. Now the hand that's going to be closed, I was kind of worried about the fingers possibly getting caught on something and broken because they're kind of hooked shaped. So what we're going to do to keep this from happening is I'm going to take the tips of the fingers and I'm going to connect them to the tip of the thumb. That way it's just kind of like an O shape and there's nothing anything can get caught on. So I'm going to get all the clay laid out for the fingers, blended into the rest of the hand, and possibly shape it a little bit to make some knuckles or something like that. Once I like the basic shape of it, I'll add some texture here and there, and I did add some fingernails to the ends of the fingers and the thumb. And then the other hand is basically the same thing, except the fingers are not curved, so I just had to make 2 straight fingers and 1 thumb. Now I don't have the habit of making hands, so I did put a lot of effort into remembering that I wanted him to be right-handed and to not make 2 of the same hand. So I got my hands done. I'm going to put those in the oven for 275 Fahrenheit for probably about 35 to 45 minutes. Now for his axe, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to use a paintbrush for the handle. So this is a really old one that needs to be retired, so I'm just going to remove the top of it and then I'm going to sand the wood. So I'm going to remove the glazing and the paint off of the wood and just make sure that everything is nice and clean. Then I'm going to take some clay and I'm going to roll out a sheet of it and cut the shape for the axe head. I'm also going to cut a piece for the back of the axe for decoration. Now I'm not going to put everything together right away. I'm going to make the head of the axe first and bake it. That way it can stay nice and straight and I don't have to worry about it being lopsided or anything like that. So I'm going to focus on that first and then we'll put everything together once that's baked. So like I said, I'm making a basic shape for the head of the axe. I've smoothed the edges and I'm going to start decorating it. I'm just going to add some extra lines here and there, some rivets, and then I had some metal pieces that I wanted to throw in as well. So once I decorated it, I made sure that it was nice and flat because I didn't want it to curve or anything like that, and then I put it in the oven to bake. Now for this, I baked it for probably about 35 minutes. And then once the axe head was out of the oven and cooled to touch, I decided that I wanted to sand the very end of it. So I didn't do this to make it sharp, I did it mainly so it wouldn't look blunt, because it was kind of a little rough at the edges and I wanted it to be nice and smooth. So it really isn't sharp at all, but it does look a lot better than leaving it completely blunt. Now we need to start assembling our axe. So I'm going to take a little bit of clay and I'm going to wrap it around the end of the paintbrush, the part that we're going to use for the axe head. And then I'm going to take the axe pieces and I'm going to push them into the sides of that clay piece. We're going to clean up the end, blend everything together, make sure it's one solid piece, and then we can add a little bit more decoration to this as well. Now before we move on to the painting of everything, I'm going to point out that I don't have the footage for painting the axe. I've looked everywhere for it. I've been kind of off and on sick, so I probably was delirious and accidentally deleted it instead of adding it to anything because I couldn't find it on my memory cards, I couldn't find it anywhere in iMovie or any files, nothing. So I gave up looking, I can't find it at all. If it shows up, it's going to be a miracle and it's not going to be showing up anytime soon, so I'm just going to get the editing of this video done. So basically, after I baked the axe for its final time, which by the way I did for about 45 minutes at the 275 Fahrenheit, I ended up painting it with a silver paint. So the head of the axe I painted silver, and then I kind of, instead of whitewashing over it, I kind of blackwashed over it with some black paint to get it into all the little crevices and stuff, and just wiped away any excess black paint so you could still see the metal, and then I painted the handle black as well. I didn't really do anything special to it at all. But it's still annoying that I can't find the footage. Anyways, let's move on to painting the other clay pieces. So for the painting for the head, the first thing that I did was I primered the whole thing with a brown paint, very similar to the color of fur that I'm going to end up using for the body. So I got everything completely covered and dried, and then I started adding some details. So like the shadowing inside of the nostrils and the shadowing in the mouth, I did that with a nice black. I went around the eyes with some shadows and some highlights and just kind of corrected things here and there. I also went over his face a little bit more with a bronze paint just because I thought it matched the color of my fur fabric a bit more than the color that I used to primer everything. And then once I got all the painting done, I let it dry, and then I took one of my tools and I scraped off any paint that got on the eyes or the ring. Now when I started painting the hooves, I kind of wanted them to be like a darker brown, but I ended up changing my mind, so you'll see me primer them brown, and then you'll see me primer them black afterwards. So I ended up deciding to go with a black hoof. So once I got the hooves primered black and everything was dried, I decided to take a little bit of white paint, just a little bit, and whitewash the front of the hoof to give it a highlight. And then for the hands, these are going to be painted the same brown as the face, and what I originally was painting the hooves with. So I'm going to primer them brown, and then I'm going to add some kind of more red browns on the knuckles and stuff to add a highlight to them, and then I'm also going to add a little bit of shadowing here and there. I'm going to paint his fingernails black, and then I'm going to add some highlights around his knuckles and the joints on his fingers. And then once I have everything completely painted and dried, I'm going to mix up some resin and paint over all the clay pieces that we painted with it. Make sure that these are set off somewhere safe to dry and cure overnight. So since those are going to take roughly about 48 hours to dry, I'm going to start unsewing the body and putting everything together. We're going to be doing the body completely different from how I normally do bodies. Okay, so this is the pattern that I'm going to use to make his body. So this is a little bit different, mainly because I'm going to be putting it together while sewing it instead of sewing pieces and then putting everything together. So I'm going to get all my fabric cut out, and then we're going to make a wireframe for this. Normally I make my wireframe after some of the sewing has been done so I can make adjustments, but we're going to be making the wireframe first. So we may have to cut the wires shorter here and there, so I'm not going to make them perfectly measured up with the patterns that we have. So this is going to be a very simple one. I've got a piece of wire for the spine and the tail, and then I've got a piece of wire that's going to be his left arm and left leg, and his right arm and right leg. Those are going to be combined. Now these pieces are made out of a 16 gauge, and then I'm going to take a 20 gauge and wrap them all together. Now we can start sewing pieces and adding them to the wireframe. So I'm going to start with his tail first. I have a strip of fabric for the body of the tail, and then the tip of the tail is kind of like a teardrop shape with the bottom of it flattened. So we're going to sew these two pieces together, and then I'm going to fold them, and we're going to sew down the side of it, closing them up. Then we can just slide this over the wireframe, and we can either sew this in place or glue it in place. I kind of did a little bit of both. I took the string that I was sewing it with and I wrapped it around the wire frame to kind of combine it with it, and then I went over that with a glue to kind of make sure that it didn't unravel or anything like that. Now we're going to take the sides of his body. So he has a front and a back. These are exactly the same, so you don't have to worry about which one is which. And then I'm going to kind of glue these to the base of where his tail is, and we're going to start sewing him up. I'm going to glue them around the base of the tail, and then we're going to start sewing down the sides. While we're sewing, we're going to have to sew around the wires for the legs and arms. And then when we get to the very top, we're going to stuff this body portion and close it up. After that, we're going to take our hair trimmer and we're going to start shaving the body. I'm going to leave the back portion kind of longer, but the very front of him, I'm going to make it as short as I can. That way you can kind of see his chest muscles and different things like that. Now what we need to do is we need to take the fabric pieces for the legs and the arms and get them ready to add to the wireframe. So I'm going to take the inside portion and the outside portion of all of those pieces, and we're going to sew down the fronts of them. So the inside portion of the arm is going to be sewn, and then the outside portion of the legs are going to be sewn. So that way we can close up the backings of each. Now at this point you'll want your clay pieces basically ready to work with, because we'll need to add our hooves when we start putting our legs together. So I'm going to take the fabric for the legs and I'm going to start sewing them around those wires for the legs. So I'm just going to sew them into place on the body. Then I'm going to take our hooves and I'm going to add these to the wire frame. So I'm going to wrap them in place, make sure they're nice and secure. And then I'm going to take the ends of the fabric for the legs and I'm going to start gluing them around the bases of the hooves. So I'm going to get those all the way around. I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and then we can stuff and close up the backings of our legs. And then once we have the legs added to the wire frame and they're all put together, we're going to shave that fur fabric as well. So I'm going to mainly focus around the fronts. I'll leave the fur fabric a little longer in the back and just kind of clean everything up, and that way you can see the shape of the legs. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to do the same thing to the fabric for the arms. So I'm going to be sewing these in place similar to how we did the legs, just sewing them around the bases of the wires for them. And then we're going to add the hands to the ends of the wires for the arms. So we're going to wrap those into place and then take the fabric for the wrists and glue them into place around the bases of the hands, let those dry, stuff and close up the arms. And then of course, since we did the shaving for the legs, we're going to shave the arms as well. Okay, so his legs are done, his arms are done. Now we're going to start adding his chest muscles and then his head. So I have the pieces of fabric that are going to go down the front of him and the back. And I'm just going to sew these into place on the front of his body and the back of his body. Once I have them sewn onto the body, I'm then going to start sewing them around the tops of the arms and then closing everything up after adding a little bit of stuffing. Now the back portion I'm going to leave nice and furry, so I'm not going to touch that, but I am going to shave the front. But I'm also going to leave a little bit of fur at the base to kind of divide it. So I kind of want the top portion of his chest muscles shaved, but he's going to kind of have like a little bit of longer hair covering his stomach. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add the head. So we're going to add this to the wire for the neck. We're going to glue that into place and let it dry. And then we're going to take the fabric for his neck and we're going to start sewing it onto the body. We're going to sew that into place and then we're going to glue it around the base of his head, and depending on if you have room for it, you'll stuff it. If not, you don't need to. And then just like everything else we've added to the body, we're going to shave that as well. Okay, so his body is basically put together and we're going to start finishing up some final details. So we're going to start on his face. For his face, I'm going to start with making some ears. I made these out of felt. They're really simple. I just kind of took 2 pieces of felt, that way the inside portion of the ear could be a different color than the outside. I glued them together, cut them out, and then we're just going to glue them into the holes for the ears. Once we have the ears in place, we're going to start furring the face. So I'm going to take some fabric glue and I'm going to cover portions of the face where I want them to be furred, and then I'm going to sprinkle in or kind of push in my fur trimmings. I'm then going to use some tools to kind of adjust the layout to make sure everything looks nice and neat, and then we're going to let that dry. Now you're probably wondering where his horns are. I'm going to be making those out of Instamorph and adding them later. I'm doing that so they're nice and strong and I don't have to worry about them cracking or anything like that. But I needed them out of the way because I'm going to be making him kind of a armored chest piece. Nothing too fancy. It's mainly just going to have some strips of fake leather and some metal findings and stuff like that. While going through my things, I realized I had a little bit of scale mail, so I'm going to use some of this to make some armor on his shoulder. So I'm going to take a strip of fake leather that I cut, and I'm going to add these to the very middle of it because that's going to be where we have the shoulder covered. And then for the strap that's going to hold this in place, this is going to be kind of a thinner strap. I'm going to sew that in place, and I'm going to start adding some other metal pieces here and there to it. Now with this little bit of armor, I did want to have a spot to where we could add the axe. So I took a very small piece of fake leather and I kind of made a little loop and I sewed that into place on the back portion. So this is where you can slide the axe into place if he's not holding on to it. Oh, and the reason I have all these chains off to the side is I was originally thinking of adding them, but once I got to a certain point, I realized it was probably going to make him look a little too busy, so I didn't do any of that. So I'm going to sew that strap into one side. Once I have all the metal findings onto it, I'm going to sew it to the other side, and then we can slide this over his head, and then sew the very bottom portion closed as well. So this won't come off unless you cut it off. So I put it on, it fit perfectly, and then I closed everything up, and then I glued his horns into place. Okay guys, and that's how I made a Minotaur. I had so much fun with this project, especially messing around with making armor and weapons for them. I definitely want to make more creatures that I can do that with in the future. So I'm going to have him along with a bunch of other creatures in my Etsy shop, so check the links down below if you want to buy anything. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!